All right. Hello, everyone. We are all here to chat about the open source project of Polaris. Polaris is around how to ensure Kubernetes best practices, or at least it's a tool that we will dive into more to take a look at how it helps us with best practices. I am Rachel Sweeney. I am an Insights Enablement Engineer, tech lead. I came from an SRE background and a DevOps engineer background. Now I work with our tooling here at Fairwinds, and we'll chat a little bit about Fairwinds. And I am joined by Andy.
Hi, everybody. I'm Andy. I'm the CTO here at Fairwinds. I'm an author and contributor to a lot of our open source and just a huge fan of everything open source and everything Kubernetes. So thanks for having me.
All right, so before we jump in, a quick comment about Fairwinds. This is where Andy and I work along with Dave. And here at our mission statement, Fairwinds is the trusted partner for Kubernetes security, policy, and governance. With Fairwinds, customers ship cloud native applications faster, more cost effectively, and with less risk. We provide a unified view between DevSec and Ops, removing friction between those teams with software that simplifies complexity. So Fairwinds at a higher level or just more, essentially part of Fairwinds works with, managing Kubernetes clusters for clients. We have worked with, tons and tons of customers managing hundreds of clusters, and we'll see a lot of the same problems come up over and over again when people deploy to Kubernetes. And that's where we're going to chat about the Polaris side of things. And on the other side of Fairwinds, we have a software as a service platform where we've taken all this expertise that we have in-house, all of the different things we've seen from developing open source software to managing customers, managing clients with customers, and doing advisory services and that type of stuff. And I've created a platform that makes it a lot easier to get visibility into a lot of clusters, put governance and best practices first and foremost, and get that information where it's most helpful. So without further ado, right before, I guess there is further ado after all, right before we jump into that, let's start with this polling question. So what is your greatest opportunity to improve your Kubernetes environment? Is it getting help with the basics? Maybe it's general best practice assessment. Is it improving the security posture of your clusters? Perhaps it's saving money is what you care most about, or maybe it's improving the reliability of apps running in Kubernetes. If you all want to share what you're thinking about now, that'd be helpful, and we can kind of tailor this a little bit towards that.
I like doing these in Zoom because it actually tells me I can't vote. When we do this in other platforms, they let me vote, and I'm never sure, am I supposed to vote? Am I not? Because I would definitely say A. I mean, I definitely need help with all the basics of Kubernetes.
Yeah, there's so many. And I feel like with every new release, there's some new thing to focus on. And API gateway being a thing that's coming up on the horizon, like that'll be fun to play with.
Definitely. Never a dull moment.
So I'll wait another 10 seconds and close the poll. But right now it's looking like a tie between getting help with the basics, general best practice assessment, and improving the security posture of your clusters. Actually, best practice assessment just took the lead. The others are 50-50.
Perfect. That's exactly what we're going to talk about today.
All right. Well, yeah, with that, why don't we dive right in? Do you want to kick us off with the demo, Andy?
Sure. This is the fun part. I get to push buttons and hope everything works and doesn't break. So I am going to start completely from scratch today. I'm going to use a tool called Kind to build a Kubernetes cluster. So that's short for Kubernetes in Docker, if you've never heard of it. So it's a nice, quick, easy way to run a Kubernetes cluster on your local machine. All you have to have installed is Docker and this Kind binary. So we see it's spinning up a 1.23 cluster. And so once that comes up, should be fairly quick, we will see that we have a node available. It's not quite ready yet, but it'll get there shortly. And so we have a completely empty cluster, brand new, nothing hiding in the background there. And then I'm going to do something that I don't normally like doing, but I have a lot to do here. I'm going to install a bunch of stuff with a single command.
So yeah, what are we installing? So we've got the Kind cluster set up. We're working locally. And so now we have this Kubernetes cluster that we can play around with. And you just dropped a bunch of commands into the command line. Do you want to talk us through that, like what those were?
Sure, happy to. So the first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to install a demo application. So we have in our incubator Helm charts on GitHub, we have just a basic demo application chart that it's just a multi-tiered app. It's got, actually this one's not multi-tiered, apologies. It's just a deployment, an HPA, a PDB, some basic Kubernetes application stuff. We'll kind of show that a little bit here, but just know it's a fairly straightforward application. And then what I've also done is I've generated the YAML for that in this directory here, and we'll see why I've done that here in just a minute. So I did a Helm template command to output the same YAML that was used to deploy that application right here into this local folder. And then I've also installed the metrics server and cert manager. So the metrics server is just something that I typically install in every Kind cluster because it's useful and it makes HPAs function, out of the box. And then also cert manager will be used as a prerequisite for an installation for some webhooks we're going to run later. So those are the three different things that I added here.
So Kind metrics helps with HPAs like horizontal pod autoscalers. We have deployed this sample app that's probably like what a lot of companies have. You've got some workload, you want to put it in Kubernetes, and we've now got metrics so it can scale out horizontally using some of the beautiful things built into Kubernetes. And so yeah, how do we know that what we're deploying is actually best practice, or are we just crossing our fingers and hoping that bad stuff doesn't happen?
Great question. So that's where Polaris comes in. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to install Polaris. So if I use the ASDF package manager, there's other ways to install it. You can see those in our documentation or on our GitHub page for Polaris. But I'm going to use ASDF. So I'm going to plug in add Polaris. And I already actually have it added because I use Polaris all the time. And we see that the latest Polaris version is 7.0.1. And I've already added it, so we can just double check. Polaris is here. I have the CLI version of Polaris available. And so the first thing I'm going to do is just a very basic first command you run with Polaris, which is Polaris audit. And that's going to spit out this score at the very end, which is in kind of a summary of all the things that we've looked at, and all this JSON.
So looking at this, we've deployed this app into the cluster. We want to know if we have best practices. So we've got this tool, Polaris. It's open source. Anybody can go out right now and download it, play around with it. We've run this audit command in the command line, and what are we looking at? And is there a way to make this look cleaner? Because I'm not quite sure what all this is.
Yeah, definitely. So there's a couple of flags that will modify the output of the Polaris CLI, especially for this sort of demo or the sort of thing you're doing. If you just want to kick the tires on it. So we have a format pretty, which is going to give us a very much nicer output because I don't like reading JSON just straight out. And then in this case, maybe I'm really just concerned about that app I just installed in the demo namespace. I don't want to look at the whole cluster. Maybe I'm in a shared cluster and I'm not responsible for all the rest of the stuff. Maybe I don't have the access. So I'm going to run this in just my demo namespace where we installed the demo app. And then we'll do that and we'll see here all the different checks that Polaris runs. So we actually see that we've passed a lot of tests. And we've also failed a couple of tests. So if I scroll up here, we can go up. We see that Polaris is aware of different workload controllers. As we see, we only looked at one namespace. There was one controller found, and there was only one node in this cluster, as we knew already. And then we see a whole bunch of different checks. So deployment missing replicas is a reliability check. And it's going to check for different security reliability things. So we have pull policy should be always, and that's a warning level check. And all of these different checks, which ones are run and what levels that they are set at can actually be configured with a configuration file. So you can modify that a little bit. So this is great. We see all the stuff we passed. We're doing a lot right, but we're really focused on what we're doing wrong. So there's one more flag that I want to add, which is only show failed tests. And so now we're going to get, and let me clear the screen here so we get a little better view of that. We see that there's only really 2 checks in this demo namespace that we're failing. So we haven't specified a tag on our image. So if we look at the deployment spec here, the image that we're deploying, we have specified the latest image. Well, that's not a great practice because that can be removed at any given time or swapped out at any time. So Polaris is going to tell us we shouldn't do that. It's also going to tell us that our image pull policy should be always rather than if not present. So we're failing both of those checks.
One great thing about Polaris, so I think I first stumbled upon Polaris, I don't know, a year or 2 ago. And, you know, it was when I was a little bit earlier on my Kubernetes journey. And there were so many of these checks that we saw, like when you see that complete list, and we're passing a lot of them, which is great, but you might be passing them just by chance. And it helped me looking into each one of these checks, like, why does this actually matter that we want the image pull policy to be set to always? Or, you know, why should we set CPU requests? You know, that affects reliability, but how? And for me, what really helped is there are some great docs in the Polaris website that essentially shows what all of these checks are with a little bit of information about them. So you can just kind of get a high level understanding. And then from there, you know, you can Google more if you want to dive in deep about why you should set host IPC and stuff like that. But if security is your focus, there's some great, you know, best practice checks around security, also around efficiency, reliability, and all that good stuff. So I know a lot of you mentioned that, you know, getting best practices under your belt, kind of getting those basics. This is a great way to use a tool to kind of figure out what you should care about and start to look at and pay attention to, because you can pull down YAMLs off the internet, but are they doing best practices? You know, use Polaris. It's going to help you figure that out. You can educate yourself at the same time if you don't know why they work the way they do. So yeah, I really, really like this tool. So we looked at it in the CI, or not in the, getting ahead of myself here. We looked at it in the command line, but what if we're not deploying via the command line? Like, what if we do have a CI pipeline? Like, we're using Jenkins, maybe GitHub Actions because we're a newer organization. Can we bake this into that? And what would that look like?
Yeah, definitely. So that's why I went ahead and templated out these YAMLs into this folder. So if you don't have access to the cluster, or you want to run it in your CI pipeline, or just against some manifests, just to double check, like you mentioned, just pulling raw manifests off the internet, maybe I want to scan those. So we can run almost an identical command to what we did before. So the Polaris audit command, and then we're just going to add one more flag, which is the audit path flag. And I'm just going to point it directly at my deployment YAML in this particular case. You should be able to do a whole folder worth of YAML if you want, or if you want to, Helm template. I think we might, I don't remember actually, we might be able to pipe in standard in or not, but there's different ways you can manage that. But now I can run this directly against my YAML and get very similar results. And that didn't need any access to the cluster. See, our nodes and namespaces is 0 because we don't know, and we don't have any concept of that when we're scanning audit paths. But we did find this deployment controller, and it does have containers in it. We still see these same 2 warnings. There is a little bit of a caveat here that this deployment doesn't have replicas specified, because I have a horizontal pod autoscaler. And so I don't want to specify replicas. And so in this case, there might be a good opportunity to use an exemption or use that configuration file that I was talking about earlier. So
that's awesome. So yeah, now we can, we know we can run it on the command line. We know we can run it in our CI pipeline, piece it in there, hopefully get more service ownership by letting developers see things if they're involved in writing YAML manifests or setting things for that. What if, can we just get Polaris to fix it for us? I think most engineers are pretty lazy and we just want things to be automated, which is why we're in engineering. Does Polaris have that functionality built in?
Definitely. A good sysadmin is a lazy sysadmin, I used to say back in the day. So yeah, we recently introduced, in addition to a mutating webhook, which we'll talk about later, but as part of that functionality, we introduced this Polaris fix command. And so what this is going to do is for specific checks that have mutations available in them, and you can read more about how that's configured in the documentation. I don't want to go too deep into configuration today. But what we can do for a specific set of checks is just automatically fix the YAML or use that to generate, a pull requests or new YAMLs. So we noted that the image pull policy was insecure. So if I rerun that audit command against my YAML here using that audit path, we know that this pull policy is not always. So I'm going to go ahead and run the Polaris fix command. And I'm going to use this files path directive to tell it what to fix. And I'm going to point it at my deployment. And by default, Polaris is going to fix specifically that image pull policy. We made that the kind of the default available mutation or change that you can make because it's really low hanging fruit. There's almost never a really good reason to not set that image pull policy to always. You're still using the underlying container runtime's ability to cache images, even when you have it set to always. It's just going to always do that check and make sure we have the latest updated image and mitigate any security issues with somebody having slipped a new image in underneath us with the same name. So we ran that Polaris fix command, and then I'm just going to go ahead and rerun the audit. And we see here that that pull policy not always has disappeared. So if we look at that particular file again, we can see that the image pull policy here on line 30 has been changed to always. It was off. It was if not present before. So that's the Polaris fix command. You use that for all kinds of different stuff.
That's awesome. Is that, out of curiosity, is that configurable? Like, can I change certain things to go and others not to?
Definitely. So if we go and we look at, I'm trying to remember where the docs are specifically for that. If we look at the configuration reference, actually that maybe not be the right one. I do know it's definitely configurable, but actually I have to go dive into the configuration for that. But for each check, we have go to the Polaris source code. We go to checks and we look at the pull policy not always YAML. We see here that we have this mutations block. This is what controls what mutations are available for this check. And so this says change the image pull policy path to always. And that's, path is at the top level of the container spec. So it's right there. But this allows you to kind of write any mutation that you want into a custom check. And then if we look at the help text for the fix command again, we can see which checks are allowed to be fixed. So you can specifically say only fix this check when you run the fix command. And that's also configurable via configuration file as well.
That's awesome. This is such a fun tool because there's just so much, so many different things to play around with. So let's say, I'm working at an organization and I have a manager who wants to know, like, how are things going for best practices? And, I guess we could probably show them the command line or dump some files for them to look at, but it's not there's like no report there. It's not pretty. Is there any other way to consume this data or take a look at it?
Definitely. So up till now, we've just shown the CLI of Polaris, but there is a Helm chart and there is a dashboard that you can run in your clusters. So I'm going to do a new Helm install command. I'm going to, in the Polaris namespace, install the Fairwind stable Polaris chart, pass the create namespace flag. And so that's going to go ahead and install Polaris into my cluster. So if we read the output here from that command, we actually have this nice handy little port forward available to us right away. Obviously, you could put an ingress in front of that or do something else in order to make it available. We're just going to port forward today. And we can go back to our browser here and go to localhost 8080, refresh, and we see an overview for our cluster here on this dashboard. So we see the number of checks that are passing. We see the number that are in error. We see the number of warning checks. We're going to give you a grade. It's based on your score. So we got a C+ here. Not terrible, not amazing. We got some just basic information about this. We know we only have one node. We've got 9 namespaces. I'm not certain why it says we have 0 pods. That's interesting. But anyway, we can scroll down and we'll get an overview of each category now. So we gave you an overall cluster score, but now we have 3 different categories. Rachel mentioned those earlier. They're also available in the docs, but each check fits into a specific category: reliability, efficiency, and security. And so we can get kind of a nice little overview of how we're doing on each one of those. And then we scroll down and we'll see each namespace and all of the different controllers and objects that we're looking at in those namespaces. So like in the Kube system namespace, we have a daemon set called KindNet, which is the network overlay for kind, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Again, if you don't want to look at all of this, you can filter down by namespace. So I want to just look at my demo namespace, and we'll see here the same overview, but filtered down to that namespace. So this is akin to the output that we saw earlier. We have a score of 92. We've got 18 passing checks, a warning check, a dangerous check. Scroll down into the reliability section, or actually, sorry, down into the namespace section for that deployment. And we see those exact same 2 things that we were looking at earlier. So just a little more consumable version of what we were looking at on the CLI here in the dashboard. We also have a link out to the docs. And one of the things that I love about the dashboard is that if I'm looking at it, I see, okay, image pull policy should be always. What does that mean? We have this little link here that's going to take you straight out to the docs for the reliability checks. And here's that pull policy check and what's going on with that. And we can read further into it. So we can dive straight into the documentation from there.
I really liked, the first time I set up that dashboard, it was just so nice just to be able to get such clean visibility into all the different namespaces. And yeah, those help bubbles taking me to the docs. And there's even some great videos linked to from like previous KubeCons about why certain areas of reliability you should really be paying attention to. And yeah, it's just such a great resource for like leveling up that Kubernetes understanding for those basic best practices for deploying. Because there's so many things with Kubernetes, just all these little toggles and switches that do different things. And sometimes we need them, sometimes we don't. And if we only need this one, we should, never ever use it unless we have to. So yeah, great way to, get more visibility, share it with other people so they can see how it's working. So with these resources, like, let's say we spend a bunch of time, setting all this up, and we do all the hard work of making sure that we are following all these best practices. So now we've got like CPU requests and limits set. We've got, we're not running as root, all that good stuff. We finally checked off all these boxes. Is there some way to like enforce this or lock it in so that, I'm going to onboard a new engineer, and what if they don't know the best practices and they pull down some random YAML file? Like, how do we put some guardrails up there, and what does that look like?
Yeah. Definitely. Great question. So, the original dream of Polaris was to build these guardrails. So like we were managing clusters for customers, and we saw that most of the problems we had in our clusters, most of the time when things broke, it was because people were violating these various recommendations and causing instability in the cluster. So generally related to, CPU memory and memory requests and limits, but, other things as well. And so the dream was to really build guardrails into these clusters so that our customers wouldn't deploy things that were going to cause them issues down the road. And so Polaris has a validating admission controller as well that we can install. And so I'm going to rerun my exact same Helm command, but I am going to set a value called webhook.enable equals true. And what that's going to do is it's going to create a validating admission webhook configuration, which is a serious mouthful of an object name. And thank goodness for autocomplete. But we can take a look at that. We see we have a Polaris validate webhook in here, and that's going to point back to a pod in the Polaris namespace, which is the Polaris webhook. By default, we also leverage Cert Manager to manage the certificate for that Polaris webhook. You can provide your own, but Cert Manager is definitely the easiest way to do that, which is why I installed Cert Manager earlier on in this process. And so now what we're going to do is test that out. So our webhook should be running, and it should be stopping us by default from deploying anything that breaks a high severity rule or a critical rule as defined by default. And so if we go back to our audit commands and we run that real quick, we'll see, sorry, I said critical, I meant danger. But we'll see that tag not specified is considered by default a danger level item. And so we shouldn't be able to deploy anything that violates that rule. So what I'm going to do is rerun the install of the demo application that I did at the very beginning. So it's just a Helm upgrade -- install in the demo namespace of our demo chart. And then I've set this value to if not present because we're trying to demonstrate the values of Polaris here. But we know that the image tag is set to latest because we've seen that before in this cluster. And so if I go ahead and run that, I'm going to see Polaris prevented this deployment due to configuration problems. Container basic demo image tag should be specified. So now I have not even been able to deploy anything that violates that rule. And we can verify that that's the case by setting a new tag. We set the image.tag to 1.0.0, and we get right through our Helm install, and we see the output from that. And so that's how the validating admission webhook runs. When you deploy the Polaris admission webhook into the cluster, you can provide a Polaris configuration that defines what's considered danger, what's considered warning, what checks you want to run. And so it will only block on the things that you want to block on.
This is awesome. So just thinking about this out loud, when I want to deploy something to the cluster, the API server, the first thing it's going to do is like authorize and check to make sure I am who I say I am. It's going to maybe make some mutations. If there's some kind of mutating piece in there, it's going to validate the schema of the YAML to make sure that, we didn't have indents in the wrong place or something. And then the very last thing before something gets into the cluster is this validating webhook. So in the case of Polaris, we've set it up so that we decide that if this check is not passing, then just don't let it in the cluster. And so, yeah, what a cool webhook to be able to configure and just have this gate right in front of the cluster to prevent it from being able to be deployed. So thinking about this, in that API server, piece that we just talked about, there's a mutating webhook part that can actually change things. And I know we saw in the command line how it can just fix things for us, like changing the image pull policy to always. Can we have it running in the cluster and just changing it on the fly if we want? Like, is that an option?
Definitely. It's actually the whole reason we created the fix command. Was to eventually get to this mutating webhook situation. So this is all relatively new to Polaris, by the way. We released this, I think, in just the last few months or so. And so definitely always open to feedback on that if y'all want to open issues in our GitHub repo. But we have introduced that for sure. So in order to show how that works, I'm going to first, due to some weirdness when you're dealing with webhooks and validating webhooks and all that good stuff, I'm going to go ahead and actually delete the Polaris chart and reinstall it. So we're going to go ahead and reinstall it. We've got our webhook enabled, and then I'm also going to set webhook.mutate equals true. And so we're going to enable the mutation. I think actually I have another value I need to add here. For this particular version of the chart, which is webhook.enable mutation. I believe we've fixed this in later versions of the chart, so we don't have to set both these values. But if we take a look in the Polaris namespace, we still have the webhook pods that we expect. But now we can take a look at mutating webhook configurations in the cluster, and we'll see that there's a Polaris mutation webhook. And you know what, we can go ahead and take a look at that and get an idea of kind of what these look like if anybody's curious. Basically, we're taking all the top level controllers and passing them to this webhook. And then obviously that cert I mentioned is managed to it, but we're going to point to the /mutate endpoint on the webhook pods rather than the /admission, which is what we used on the previous one. And so in order to get an idea of what this is doing, let's go ahead and run our Polaris audit against the cluster. And in our namespace demo and only showing the failed tests. And we see we still have that pull policy, not always. Fix the image tag as part of our admission webhook. Well, we still have that pull policy, not always. And we already know from the earlier demonstration with the fix command, Polaris knows how to change this. It's in that mutations block of this check definition. And so I'm going to go ahead and install the demo app again. Again, I'm explicitly setting the image pull policy to if not present in this installation. I have to set my image tag because otherwise the validating webhook is going to block us again. And so I'm going to go ahead and run that and it should succeed. And if we go ahead and run our audit again, we're actually going to see that we're suddenly getting a 100 because as that deployment was deployed into the cluster, the mutating webhook modified it to change that pull policy for us. So if we get the deploy in the demo namespace, I don't really need to show this because Polaris just told us this, but we can see that the image pull policy on that deployment is always, and we can take a look. I think if we take a look at the logs, well, that's fun. That was not a great example there, but we should see in the log somewhere that we mutated that particular object. So that's an example of that. Again, with those checks, you can define what the mutations look like. That affects both the fix command and the mutating webhook. And with the configuration file, you can definitely configure which things are allowed to mutate, which ones aren't, what checks are enabled, and all that good stuff. Completely configurable across the board.
I think what's really cool about that is that, you know, if you set up the admission or the validating webhook to not allow, let's just say image pull policy, you know, you have to set it to image pull policy being always. It's not going to let anything into the cluster unless you do that or set that. But now with that mutating webhook, we can actually take it a step further and just inject it in there. So even if our developers or our engineers who are putting stuff into the cluster aren't doing that, you can make that best practice and kind of inject it into there and then have the validating webhook be like, okay, it passed the test, it can now go in the cluster and it's good to go. So one thing that, you know, we've certainly seen is as people go along in the Kubernetes journey, you start off with a cluster, things grow. Now you've got like a dev cluster, a staging cluster, a prod cluster. Maybe you've got one for one region of the world and another, and just clusters are growing. How do you keep all of this like in mind? Or is there some way to make this easier and less painless since that can quickly grow out of hand?
Definitely. Definitely. So the open source Polaris obviously does all the wonderful things that we showed today. It has all the admission webhooks, and you know, you can, we didn't talk about it, but you can add custom checks and very configurable. But it's really designed to work within one cluster. It's very specific to a single cluster. So that dashboard is installed in one cluster. It doesn't have any multi-cluster capabilities. And so if you want to expand that into multiple clusters, obviously, you know, it's open source. You can, you know, use the output of it and manage it across multiple clusters. But you're really, you know, leaning into what our SaaS product does really well. So Fairwinds Insights is like multi-cluster Polaris with a whole lot of other awesome stuff. So there's a lot more than just Polaris here. But if we take a look at Fairwinds Insights, this is our commercial offering, we can see that it incorporates Polaris as part of its tooling. So if you started out with Polaris as open source and it's just, you know, not scaling out to multiple clusters and you have bigger problems, then you can work around with Polaris. Insights might be a great option for you. We can take a look here. Fairwinds Insights at its core really is, keeps track of these action items. And so if we take a look and filter down to just the Polaris report, you'll see we have a lot of other things in here, including some of our other open source, but we can filter down just to those Polaris results. And we'll start to see the things that we were looking at earlier. So the image pull policy should be always. Things we didn't talk about memory limits, CPU limits, replica counts. And these are all across multiple clusters. So if we see here, we have a bunch of different clusters shown, bunch of different namespaces across those clusters. And we can get a good view of these Polaris findings across all the different clusters. From here, we can also manage admission controller for those clusters and block on Polaris results. So if we go in and look at one of these many clusters, we can go to the admission controller and we can actually see a view of what has been blocked and what hasn't and why over time. And so we can manage that admission controller a little bit as well. So maybe we start to see an increase in failures because of a specific thing, and we need to start, sharing more documentation or use the mutating abilities of the admission controller. And so we can dig into those. We also have that documentation and those descriptions right here in the product. So if you're looking at that, you don't have to go out to another site, to the doc site. We give you some, interesting remediation information right here in the tool across all of your clusters.
I think one thing I really love about this platform is that it takes all these different plugins. So like we've talked a lot about Polaris today. There's a lot of other great open source tools out there. Like let's say you're focused on upgrades, Pluto and Nova are two really good tools for helping you figure out, like, can I safely upgrade to version 1.22 of Kubernetes, since there were a ton of deprecated APIs in there. And if you just upgrade without fixing some of those, it's going to cause some issues. And so just like Polaris, Pluto and Nova, they're great open source tools. You can run them in any cluster, you can download them. They're going to give you great information. But the platform of Insights, it kind of centralizes all of that. So as you install all of these different plugins into all of your different clusters, it gives you that one centralized view into one location. So things like KubeBench and KubeHunter, both of those are great for, figuring out some security configurations. I think KubeHunter is kind of like a little mini pen testing tool to see what known holes there are in the cluster that you might want to patch up. Trivy is great for scanning, image vulnerabilities, looking out for, are we pulling down images that have known vulnerabilities that we really should have fixed up by using a newer version, or letting us know if we're suddenly, exposed to something. Open Policy Agent, that's going to let us enforce some custom policies. Maybe we want to say something like, I don't want to pull down any image from Docker Hub. It has to come from our organization's internal repo, because that's the repo that we vetted. We know it's good, and that's just how we want to set it up. And so there's all these different pieces that the platform is kind of pulling in, centralizing, getting us in one place. Here we can see there's a number of different policies you can just use out of the box and get up and running. Maybe your DNS host name is too long, since there are limits. I think there's an RFC to make sure that it should not be longer than that maximum. And if you do have it at that, beyond that, you're not going to get a cert issued, stuff like that. There's all kinds of little things like that. And as these action items come into the platform, kind of think of them as like little building blocks or little triggers that you can use to do something more. So let's say anytime a workload comes into your Kubernetes cluster, who knows which one it is, it could be any of them, you could set it up so that as soon as a CPU request is not set, create a Jira ticket for me just right away. And so that action item pops up. The trigger is that we want to create a Jira ticket based on that action item. And it's going to be off and running. You'll hopefully get that into the right hands of who it is that's monitoring that Jira board or that project, and making sure that they have that information right where they need it. There's plenty of other ways you can connect things, like there is a PagerDuty integration. So maybe there's some huge security vulnerability that comes in and you want to know about it so you can try and figure out how to remediate it. That's something you could send to PagerDuty if there's certain things you're looking for. It's also that Datadog integration. We can push all of these tools into your CI pipeline. So quite a few of them, just like how you could put Polaris in your CI pipeline, you can do the same with the Open Policy Agent. You can do that with Trivy to get those image vulnerabilities early on. And yeah, it's just a lot of really cool functionality that makes it a lot easier to manage things at scale beyond just the, one or two tools that you're installing, because you can absolutely take all of these open source tools, go play around with them, put them in your cluster, but then there becomes that burden of like, how do I keep all of this information in one location? How do I get it to the right parties at the right time when they need it? And yeah, that's one of the areas where this platform really shines and helps out. So with that, got some extra time, I guess, at this point. We should probably talk about this Kubernetes misconfiguration white paper. There's a link there. You're welcome to grab that. So please do go check that out. I think Dave might share that in an email after that or after this. Talks about a lot of the things that we talked about here as well. And since we have some extra time, we can take any questions if you have some more. We could potentially dive in more into custom checks or exemptions for Polaris, or, look at some of those. So please do, if you have any thoughts that pop up, any questions, please do drop them in the Q&A section.
Love questions.
But yeah, looking at the Polaris, configuration, like how configurable is it? Like what can we do with it? And how custom can that go?
Yeah, let's take a look. It's been a while actually since I've written a configuration file, so we can go ahead and take a look at the full configuration reference. And so I'll make this a little bit bigger here so folks can see it, but we have the full list of checks that are built in. And so every single one of them, you can configure what level you want that to exist at. So do you want it to be warning or danger? Remember, the admission controller only blocks by default on danger level items. So this is a great way to control what gets blocked and what doesn't by the admission controller. You can also do exemptions. So you can say, for example, this particular controller, so like this deployment called my network controller or whatever, doesn't get checked by Polaris. It just gets exempted entirely. You can exempt specific rules for that specific controller. So it doesn't have to be all of the things for it, but it can be just one rule for that specific controller. So you can do that in the config file. You can also do that via annotation. So if we go back to the docs, and we go look at the exemptions documentation, you can actually just put an annotation on your workload to say, skip this particular check or just skip Polaris entirely. And then one note about security about that. If you're using Polaris as an admission webhook to block insecure workloads, you would think, well, we have exemptions. Now people can just skip right past that, right? Well, you can actually set up the admission controller to ignore exemptions or to only respect exemptions that are in the configuration file. So that is exemptions. We can go back to this config and keep talking about that.
If you don't mind jumping in, we just got a question, which is a good one about someone mentioned that they've heard of two Kubernetes policy engines. We've got OPA and Kyverno, and it seems like Polaris has embedded a policy engine too. Does it use either internally? And yeah, how does it do that if it's not using Kyverno or OPA?
That's a great question. Polaris does not use either one of those. I know. Last thing we need is another policy engine, but I will say I think Polaris is fairly straightforward. It's entirely based on JSON schema. And so if we go ahead and take a look at one of these checks, let's just do the CPU limits missing, we'll see that we're actually using a YAML version of JSON schema to define these checks. So it's relatively low barrier to entry to write new checks. I think it's a little bit more straightforward than learning Rego for OPA. I don't actually have any personal familiarity with writing rules for Kyverno, but I know this is much more straightforward than writing Rego, which I have written before and is a little bit tough to wrap your head around sometimes. And so that's what Polaris is using.
Yeah, and there's a lot out of the box. I think for most people, they're happy with all the standard ones, but if you need a custom one, that's where we get into this, where you have to write this YAML that basically says, what am I looking for in the YAML manifest, and does it match that? And so that's how you would write custom checks within that.
Yep. All right. Where shall I go next? Shall I go back to config?
And yeah, we're looking at the config, and so we can see how we can drop certain checks, like maybe image pull policy being always is not something we ever care about. I guess we could just remove it from here, or just kind of mute it to a certain degree, so it's not something we care about, by dropping the label from warning or something.
Yeah, we could switch it to warning, or we could just drop it entirely out of this configuration, which means it wouldn't even check it at all if we left it out. And then you can actually add custom checks directly in line here in the config if you want. And then, yeah, that's actually pretty much the whole config. So pretty much allows you to do whatever you want here.
And yep, to add to that question, Polaris's policy engine is a lightweight one. It's not as comprehensive as Kubernetes or OPA, so exactly.
Yes, definitely. We do integrate OPA into our Insights platform as an additional one, so you can write both Polaris and OPA checks when you're using Insights as your platform. So nice way to combine those if you already have Polaris checks and you want to write OPA, or the other way around.
All right. Are there any other questions? I think we've gotten through a lot of the content pretty quickly. So if you have any other questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Otherwise, we can wrap up a little bit early. All right, well, thank you, everyone. Again, there is that Kubernetes white paper on misconfiguration, so please do check that out. There is also, as we've talked about, all those open source tools. Please feel free to check out Polaris, Nova, Pluto. There's lots of other great stuff. Looks like, yep. There's a question about Polaris being open source. Do we have a commercial version? Insights is the commercial version, which helps with scale and keeping track of everything. So, yep, happy to chat about any or all of those. If you have any questions, feel free to email us, since we are always happy to chat, even outside of this webinar. And yeah, thank you all so much for joining.